"Ma'am, don't move." The voice came from behind her, tight and controlled, the kind of voice that didn't ask twice. And Ava Johnson felt the sound of it before she fully understood the words, felt it settle between her shoulder blades like a weight she couldn't see but couldn't ignore. The sharp hum of a patrol car idling somewhere to her left, the flicker of red and blue washing over the asphalt in slow pulses, stretching shadows across the empty parking lot like something alive, and for a second the world narrowed to small details, the cool night air brushing against her skin, the faint buzz of a broken streetlight above, the distant echo of traffic a few blocks away, steady, indifferent, normal, everything about the world continuing as if nothing had just shifted, as if a single sentence hadn't quietly redrawn the line between routine and something else entirely. Ava's hand still resting on the strap of her worn laptop bag, her fingers curled but not tight, not trembling, just still, because somewhere deep in her chest something older than fear had already taken over, something practiced, something taught, and slowly, carefully, she exhaled, not turning yet, not reacting the way people expected, because reacting too fast could be misunderstood, and misunderstanding was dangerous in ways people didn't always admit out loud. The officer stepped closer behind her, boots firm against the pavement, measured, deliberate, each step closing a distance that hadn't existed seconds ago, and though she still couldn't see his face, she could hear the shift in his breathing, controlled but alert, a man who believed he was in control of the moment. "I said, don't move," he repeated, sharper now, and Ava's eyes lifted slightly, catching the reflection of those flashing lights in the dark glass of a parked SUV ahead of her, distorted, fragmented, her own outline barely visible between streaks of color. And in that reflection she saw it, not clearly, not fully, but enough. The outline of a raised arm, the rigid angle of authority, the shape of a decision already forming before any words had been exchanged, and something inside her tightened, not panic, not exactly, but recognition, because she had seen moments like this before, not always this close, not always directed at her, but enough to know how quickly they could spiral, how a single assumption could become something permanent. And yet her posture didn't change, her shoulders stayed level, her chin steady, because years ago her father had stood in a quiet living room, teaching her something he said she might need one day, his voice calm, firm. "When the world gets loud, you stay still inside." And now that memory surfaced with unexpected clarity, grounding her in a way nothing else could. The officer shifted again, closer now, the air between them tighter. And Ava finally spoke, her voice even, measured, carrying just enough to be heard without challenging. "I'm not moving," she said, each word placed carefully, like stepping stones across uncertain ground. And for a brief second there was silence, not empty, but loaded, stretched thin between two people standing on opposite sides of something neither of them had fully named yet. The lights kept flashing, red then blue, washing over her face, over the pavement, over the quiet rows of cars. And somewhere beyond the edge of that lot, the rest of the city moved on, unaware, unchanged, while right here, in this small pocket of space, everything had already begun to shift. Officer Daniel Hayes did not lower his voice, but something in it shifted, a fraction less certain, as if the silence that followed her words had pressed back against him, and Ava could feel it without turning. That subtle change in the air when authority meets something it does not immediately understand. Her fingers loosened slightly around the strap of her bag, not enough to signal ease, just enough to keep control. Because control, her father used to say, was not about force, it was about presence, and presence was something no one could take unless you gave it away. "What are you doing out here this late?" Hayes asked, the question sharp but searching now, like he was building a version of her in his head and trying to make it fit. And Ava finally turned her head just enough to meet his reflection in the car window again. Not directly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him without escalating. His uniform caught the flashing lights in fragments, badge glinting, radio clipped. Tight against his shoulder, everything about him structured, defined, practiced, and yet his eyes, even in reflection, carried that same quick judgment she had seen before, the kind that filled in gaps without asking. "I just got off work," she said, calm, even, each word steady, and the parking lot seemed to listen. The hum of the engine, the distant buzz of electricity, all of it folding into the space between them. Hayes stepped slightly to the side now, trying to get a clearer view of her, to move from silhouette to detail, and Ava knew that moment too. The moment when a person decides what they think they see, not what is actually there. Her hoodie, faded at the sleeves, her laptop bag worn from years of use. Her car parked 3 rows down. Nothing about her matching the version he expected to find in a place like this, and that mismatch lingered, stretched, creating tension that did not need words to exist. This area has had reports. He began, then stopped, as if the sentence itself did not quite land the way he wanted, and Ava let the silence sit again, not filling it, not rushing to explain herself beyond what was necessary, because over-explaining could be mistaken for something else. Something weaker, something uncertain, and she was neither. She shifted her weight slightly, slow, deliberate, making sure every movement could be seen, every intention clear. The lights flickered across her face again, highlighting the calm that did not match the situation, and for a second Hayes hesitated, just enough to register that something was off, not wrong, but unexpected, like a script that had been followed too many times suddenly missing a line. "You live around here?" he asked, and Ava let out a quiet breath. Not frustration, not fear, just patience, the kind that came from years of knowing that some questions were not really questions, they were tests, and how you answered mattered less than how you carried yourself while answering. "I work 2 blocks from here," she replied, her voice still level, still controlled, and she could feel his attention sharpen, recalibrate, as if he was adjusting the picture again, trying to place her somewhere that made sense to him. The radio on his shoulder crackled faintly, a distant voice cutting through static, then fading, reminding both of them that this moment was small in the larger system. And yet it did not feel small, not here, not now. The air felt tighter, heavier, like something waiting just beneath the surface, and Ava lifted her chin just slightly, enough to meet his gaze more directly this time. Not challenging, not defiant, just present, fully present. And in that presence there was something unshakable, something that did not match the assumptions forming in his mind, something that made him pause again, longer this time. The kind of pause that opens a door, even if only a crack, and Ava held that space without stepping through it yet, because timing, she knew, was everything. Hayes shifted his stance, just a few inches, but enough to break the rigid line he had been holding, his hand no longer as tight, his posture still firm but no longer absolute, and Ava noticed it the same way she noticed everything else, quietly, without reacting, because small changes mattered, especially in moments like this. The kind of moments that did not announce themselves as important until later, when everything had already been decided. "Do you have identification on you?" he asked. And this time the question carried something different, not softer, but less certain of the answer it expected to receive. Ava nodded once, slow and visible, her movements deliberate as she carefully slid one hand toward her bag, pausing just long enough to let him register it before continuing. Every motion controlled, every second measured, because clarity was safety, and safety was something she had learned to build piece by piece. "I am reaching into my bag," she said calmly, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his, and he gave a short nod, almost automatic, as if the structure of the exchange was something he could rely on even when everything else felt slightly off balance. She unzipped the bag slowly, the soft sound cutting through the quiet like a thin line, and inside, beneath the laptop and neatly organized folders, her fingers found her wallet, worn leather, edges softened with time, familiar, grounding. She pulled it out and held it where he could see, not extending it yet, not forcing the next step, just offering the moment as it was. Hayes stepped closer, the light catching his face now fully, revealing lines of focus that had not been there before. His eyes flicked from her face to the wallet and back again, processing, recalibrating, and Ava could almost see it happening. The shift from assumption to uncertainty, from certainty to something else entirely. He reached out, took the identification, his movements slower than before, less abrupt, and for a second their hands were close enough to feel the shared space between them. Not contact, not connection, just proximity, and that alone carried weight. He looked down at the card, the flashing lights reflecting across its surface, distorting the text, forcing him to look twice. Then again, as if the information refused to settle into something simple. Ava Johnson, he read quietly, almost to himself, and then his eyes moved further, scanning, pausing, returning, something catching his attention that he had not expected. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, louder this time. A dispatcher calling out another unit, another location, another situation entirely. But Hayes did not respond. Not yet, his focus narrowing instead, pulling inward, and Ava stood still, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, watching the moment unfold without stepping into it prematurely, because she knew that recognition, when it came, needed space, needed silence, needed time to land. Hayes lifted his gaze slowly, meeting hers again, but this time there was a question there that had not been present before, not suspicion, not exactly, but something closer to doubt, as if the narrative he had constructed moments ago was beginning to crack, just enough to let something else through, and Ava tilted her head slightly, just a fraction, acknowledging that shift without pressing it, without forcing it, because forcing it would break it, and instead she let the quiet stretch again, the lights continuing their rhythm, red then blue, the world still moving somewhere beyond them, unaware, unchanged, while right here, in this narrow space between two people, something fundamental had already begun to turn, slowly, almost invisibly, but undeniably real. Hayes looked down at the identification again, longer this time, his eyes tracing the small details he might have overlooked just seconds earlier. The subtle seal in the corner, the line of text beneath her name that did not belong to anything local, anything routine. His thumb hovered near the edge of the card, but did not move, as if even touching it again might confirm something he was not ready to fully accept. And Ava watched that hesitation settle into him, not with satisfaction, not with defiance, but with a quiet understanding of what that moment meant, because moments like this were never just about information. They were about perception shifting in real time, about someone realizing they might have been wrong before they were ready to admit it out loud. The red and blue lights continued their slow rhythm across his face, catching the slight tightening in his jaw, the faint crease forming between his brows, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone passing by to notice, but enough for her to hear it clearly. "This says federal clearance," he said, almost carefully, as if the words themselves carried weight he needed to handle correctly. Ava did not nod right away, did not rush to confirm. She simply let the silence answer for a second before speaking, her tone steady, grounded. "It does," she said, and that was all. No elaboration, no explanation, just the truth placed gently into the space between them. And Hayes exhaled, not sharply, not dramatically, just a quiet release of something he had been holding without realizing it. His eyes flicked to her bag, then back to her face, then again to the identification, trying to connect pieces that had not seemed relevant before, and Ava could see the recalibration happening, the slow dismantling of a narrative that had been built too quickly, the replacement of assumption with something more complicated, something less comfortable. "What exactly do you do?" he asked, and this time the question was different, no longer a test, no longer a challenge, but a genuine attempt to understand, and Ava shifted her weight slightly, the movement small but intentional, grounding herself again before answering, because answers mattered, but how they were delivered mattered more. "I work in cybersecurity," she said, her voice calm, measured, contracted through the Department of Defense, and she watched as the words landed, not all at once, but in layers, each part settling into place with a quiet finality. Hayes blinked once, then again, his grip on the identification loosening just slightly, his posture adjusting in a way that was almost imperceptible but entirely real, the kind of adjustment that comes when certainty gives way to reconsideration. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, louder this time, calling his name, asking for a response, but he did not answer immediately, his focus still anchored in the moment in front of him, and Ava held that space, steady, present, not pressing forward, not stepping back, simply existing in a way that no longer fit the assumptions that had brought them here. The air between them felt different now, less sharp, less charged, but still heavy with everything that had already happened, everything that had already been implied without being said. and Hayes finally handed the identification back, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if acknowledging something without fully articulating it. And Ava took it with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, her fingers steady, her gaze unwavering. And for a brief second their eyes met fully, without reflection, without distance, just two people standing in the same space, seeing each other more clearly than they had a moment ago. And in that look there was something unspoken but undeniable, something that marked the point where everything had begun to change, even if neither of them had said it yet. The silence did not resolve. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if one wrong word could tear it open again. And Hayes shifted his weight back a fraction, not retreating, not stepping away, just creating a small distance that had not existed before, his hand now fully lowered, no longer carrying the same rigid tension it had at the beginning. And Ava noticed everything, the subtle release in his shoulders, the way his gaze no longer locked onto her with suspicion, but lingered with something more complicated, something closer to uncertainty mixed with realization. And the flashing lights continued their rhythm, painting both of them in alternating color, making the moment feel suspended, almost unreal. "Why didn't you say that earlier?" Hayes asked, but there was no accusation in it now, only a quiet confusion, as if he was trying to understand how the situation had unfolded the way it had. And Ava let the question sit for a second before answering, her eyes steady, her voice calm but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Because I should not have to," she said, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, and those words landed differently. Not like information, not like explanation, but like something deeper, something that reached past the surface of the moment into everything underneath it. Hayes blinked, the kind of blink that comes when a thought does not immediately settle, and for a second he looked away, not far, just enough to break eye contact, his gaze dropping toward the pavement, as if searching for something there, something simpler, something easier to hold on to. But there was nothing there except the reflection of those lights and the faint outline of his own shadow. And when he looked back up, the shift was more visible now, not dramatic, not complete, but undeniable. The confidence he had carried at the start was no longer solid. It had softened, reshaped by the realization that he had stepped into this moment with an assumption that no longer held. "I was just doing my job," he said. But even as he spoke, the sentence felt incomplete, like it was missing something he could not quite name, and Ava heard that too, not as a defense, but as something closer to a habit, a phrase repeated enough times that it had become automatic, and she nodded slightly, acknowledging it without agreeing, without dismissing it, just letting it exist as it was. "I understand," she replied, her tone even, but her gaze did not waver, because understanding did not mean accepting everything that came with it, and Hayes seemed to register that, his jaw tightening just slightly before relaxing again. The radio on his shoulder crackled once more, louder now, a dispatcher calling his unit again, asking for a status update, the voice cutting through the quiet with a reminder that time was still moving, that other calls were waiting, that the world beyond this parking lot had not paused. And yet he did not respond right away, his attention still anchored here, still caught between what he thought he knew and what he was beginning to realize. A car passed slowly at the edge of the lot, headlights sweeping briefly across them before disappearing again, leaving the space dim once more, and Ava adjusted the strap on her shoulder slightly. The movement small, but signaling something important, not impatience, not discomfort, but readiness, as if she was preparing to move forward, to leave this moment behind. And Hayes noticed that too, his eyes following the motion before returning to her face, and for a brief second it felt like the moment might end there, quietly, without resolution, without acknowledgement, just two people stepping away from something neither of them would fully name. But the weight of what had already happened lingered, pressing gently but persistently, and Ava took a slow breath, her posture still steady, her presence still unshaken, knowing that the next words, whatever they were, would define not just the end of this moment, but what it meant. The night seemed to settle around them in a deeper way now, the sharp edge of the moment giving way to something quieter but heavier, like the air after a storm that never fully broke, and Ava stood there without moving, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that silence, when held correctly, could say more than anything else. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, reflecting off the asphalt, off the windows, off the small metal edges of everything around them, and for a second it felt like time had stretched just enough to let everything breathe. Hayes shifted again, this time more noticeably, his shoulders lowering just slightly as if the weight of his earlier certainty had finally begun to lift, and he looked at her differently now, not as a problem to solve, not as a situation to control, but as a person he had not fully seen at the start. And that realization lingered in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. His radio crackled again, calling his name with more urgency this time. But he still did not answer right away. His attention caught in something internal, something quieter than protocol. Ava let her gaze drift for a brief second toward the distant edge of the parking lot, where the world continued without interruption, headlights passing, shadows shifting, everything normal, everything untouched by what had just happened here. And then she looked back at him, steady again, present again, because this moment, however small it seemed from the outside, mattered in ways that would not be recorded, would not be reported, but would remain. "You can respond," she said softly, her voice calm, not dismissing him, not instructing him, just offering him a way back into the role he had stepped out of. And Hayes blinked, as if the suggestion pulled him out of whatever thought had held him there. He reached for his radio, his hand slower than before, more deliberate. And when he finally spoke into it, his voice was measured, controlled, but no longer carrying the same rigid edge it had at the beginning. "Unit 12, I am clear," he said. The words simple, routine, but the moment behind them anything but. The dispatcher responded quickly, moving on, the system continuing as it always did, efficient, unaware, unchanged. And Hayes lowered the radio, his hand lingering there for a second before dropping back to his side. The silence returned, but it was different now, not tense, not waiting to break, but reflective, almost still, like something had been understood without needing to be fully explained. Ava adjusted her bag slightly on her shoulder, the movement quiet, signaling that she was ready to leave. Not in a hurry, not escaping, just moving forward, the way she had intended to before any of this began. And Hayes watched that movement, his eyes following it with a focus that felt more grounded, more aware, as if he was seeing not just the action, but everything it carried with it. And for a moment he looked like he might say something, his lips parting slightly before closing again, the words forming and dissolving at the same time. Because some realizations do not translate easily into language, they sit heavier than that, deeper than that. And Ava did not wait for those words, did not need them. She simply nodded once, a small, respectful acknowledgement, not of authority, but of the shared space they had just occupied. And then she turned, her steps calm, measured, her pace steady as she began to walk toward her car, the sound of her shoes against the pavement soft but clear in the quiet. And behind her, the lights still flashed, the engine still hummed. But something in the space she left behind had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. And as she reached her car, unlocking it with a quiet click, she paused for just a fraction of a second, her hand resting on the door handle, her reflection faint in the glass, the colors of the lights still flickering across it. And then she opened the door and stepped inside, the world closing around her again, quieter now, contained, but the echo of the moment still there, steady, undeniable, like a reminder that even in silence, something important had taken place. The car door closed with a soft, contained sound that seemed to draw a line between what had just happened and everything that would come after. And for a brief second Ava sat still behind the wheel, her hands resting lightly against it, not gripping, not tense, just present, her reflection faint in the windshield as the red and blue lights continued to pulse across the glass in slow, steady waves. And outside, Hayes had not moved, not yet, his figure still outlined by the flashing lights, standing in the same place where everything had shifted only moments ago, his posture no longer rigid, no longer fixed, but held in a kind of quiet suspension, as if he was still processing something that had not fully settled. And Ava exhaled slowly, her breath steady, her eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again. Because even though the moment was technically over, something in it remained unfinished, not in action, but in meaning. She reached toward the ignition, her fingers brushing the keys, but she did not turn them yet, not immediately, because timing mattered. Even now, and outside, Hayes finally moved, one step forward, then another, not approaching her directly, but closing the distance just enough to be heard without raising his voice, and Ava noticed it through the side mirror, the small shift in his position, the hesitation in his movement, like someone stepping into unfamiliar ground. She lowered the window slightly, just a few inches, enough to let the air and his voice pass through without fully opening the space between them again. And for a second, he said nothing, the silence stretching once more, but this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but searching, as if he was trying to find words that matched what he had. "Come to understand, Ms. Johnson," he said finally, her name spoken more carefully now, more deliberately, and Ava turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze through the narrow opening, her expression calm, unchanged, but attentive, because this moment, this part, mattered in a different way. He started, then paused, the word trailing off as if it did not quite lead where he needed it to go, and Ava did not interrupt, did not fill the silence. She simply waited, giving him the space he needed, because some things could not be rushed, and Hayes swallowed once, his jaw tightening just slightly before easing again. "I made an assumption," he said, the sentence quiet, not forced, but not easy either, and those words landed with a weight that was different from everything that had come before, not defensive, not dismissive, but honest in a way that required effort. Ava held his gaze for a second longer, letting that honesty exist without immediately responding to it, because acknowledgement was not something to be given lightly. And then she nodded once, small, measured, not as acceptance, not as approval, but as recognition of the moment, of the effort it took to say that much. And Hayes looked at her, his expression steady now, but carrying something else beneath it, something closer to reflection. "You did not deserve that," he added, his voice still controlled but softer around the edges, and Ava felt the words settle, not as something new, but as something finally spoken out loud. And for a second she looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of thought, her eyes moving toward the empty stretch of parking lot ahead, where everything remained still, unchanged. And then she looked back at him, her voice calm, grounded. "No one does," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more than any explanation could have, the kind of truth that did not need to be expanded, only understood. And Hayes nodded slowly, the motion subtle but real, as if something in him had aligned with that statement in a way he could not ignore. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, softer this time, less urgent, but he did not reach for it. Not yet, his attention still here, still present, and Ava finally turned the key, the engine coming to life with a quiet hum, the sound filling the space just enough to signal that this moment was coming to an end. And as she shifted the car into gear, she gave one last glance toward him, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging, and then she eased forward, the car moving smoothly out of the space, the lights behind her fading gradually in the rearview mirror, while Hayes remained where he was, standing in the same place, but not the same person, the echo of the moment settling into him in a way that would not leave quickly, if at all. The road ahead stretched quiet and empty as Ava guided the car out of the parking lot, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement, the hum of the engine steady beneath her hands, and in the rearview mirror the flashing lights grew smaller, softer, until they became just another flicker in the distance, something almost ordinary, almost forgettable, but not quite, because moments like that never fully disappeared. They settled somewhere deeper, carried forward in ways that did not always show on the surface. And Ava kept her eyes on the road, her posture relaxed but alert, her breathing even, as if she had already placed the moment where it belonged, not ignored, not dismissed, just understood. The streetlights passed one by one above her, casting brief shadows across the dashboard, across her face, each one marking time in quiet intervals, and for a few blocks there was nothing but the rhythm of driving, the familiar movement of the world returning to its normal pace. But then her phone, resting in the center console, lit up softly, the screen glowing in the dim interior, and she glanced at it for just a second, not long enough to distract, just enough to see the name that appeared, restricted line. The label simple, unassuming, but not something that appeared by accident, and she reached over, tapping the button on her steering wheel to answer, her voice calm, composed. "Johnson," she said, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not static, not delay, just the kind of pause that carried intention. "We received a flag." A voice said, low, measured, official in a way that did not need to be explained. "Local unit initiated a stop on your coordinates." Ava kept her eyes forward, her hands steady on the wheel, the road stretching out in front of her like nothing had changed, and yet everything had. "It is handled," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not concerned, just factual. And there was another pause, shorter this time, followed by a quiet acknowledgement. "Understood," the voice said, and then the line went silent, the call ending without ceremony, without further question, because none was needed. Ava let her hand rest back on the wheel fully, her focus returning completely to the road. But for a brief moment her gaze flickered to the mirror again, the parking lot now far behind her, the lights no longer visible, and she thought about the way Hayes had stood there at the end, not as an officer asserting control, but as a man standing in the space of something he had not expected to confront, and she did not feel anger, not in the way people might assume. What she felt was something quieter, something more complex, a recognition of how quickly things could shift, how easily they could go another way if not for a single moment of clarity, a single choice to remain steady instead of reactive, and she tightened her grip on the wheel just slightly, not out of tension, but out of awareness, the kind that stays with you, the kind that sharpens your understanding of the world without hardening you against it. The city opened up ahead, wider streets, brighter lights, more movement, life continuing in its usual patterns, and Ava blended into it seamlessly. Just another car among many, just another person moving forward. But beneath that surface there was something unspoken, something that would not be visible to anyone else, the knowledge that she had walked through a moment that could have defined her in someone else's eyes, and instead, she had defined it herself, quietly, firmly, without raising her voice, without losing her ground. And as she drove on, the night stretched ahead, calm and steady, carrying her forward while leaving behind a silence that, somewhere in a dim parking lot, still echoed with a lesson that had only just begun to settle. Officer Daniel Hayes remained in the parking lot long after the sound of Ava's car had faded into the distance, the quiet settling around him in a way that felt heavier than before, not because anything had changed outside, but because something had shifted inside. The flashing lights from his patrol car continued their steady pulse, painting the empty rows of asphalt in red and blue. But now they seemed less like authority and more like a reminder, a reflection of a moment he could not simply file away and forget. He stood there with his radio resting against his shoulder, silent for once, his hand hanging loosely at his side, no longer carrying the tension that had defined him minutes earlier, and in the stillness he replayed it, not the surface of the encounter, not the questions or the answers, but the space between them, the assumptions he had made before a single word had been spoken, the certainty he had carried without realizing it, and how quickly it had unraveled when faced with something real, something undeniable. He glanced down at the pavement where Ava had stood, as if the ground itself might hold some trace of the moment, but there was nothing there, just the same worn asphalt, the same faint cracks, the same ordinary surface that gave no indication of what had taken place. And yet he knew it had mattered, not because of protocol, not because of procedure, but because of something simpler and harder to ignore, the realization that power, when used without awareness, could blind more than it could protect. His radio crackled again, softer now, another call waiting, another situation unfolding. Somewhere else in the city, and this time he responded, his voice steady but changed in a way no one on the other end would notice. "Unit 12, en route," he said, the words routine, automatic, but carrying a weight he had not felt before. He moved toward his car, each step measured, not rushed, not delayed, just deliberate, as if he was moving through something more than distance. The door opened with a familiar sound, and he paused for a brief second before getting in, his hand resting on the frame, his eyes lifting once more to the empty lot, the silence still there, still present. And in that silence there was no judgment, no voice calling him out, just the quiet echo of a truth he had already heard, one that did not accuse but did not disappear either. He slid into the driver's seat, the interior dim compared to the flashing lights outside, and for a moment he sat without starting the engine, his reflection faint in the windshield, layered with the colors that continued to flicker across it, and he saw himself differently, not dramatically, not completely changed, but aware in a way that could not be undone, aware of the line between doing a job and understanding the people within it, aware of how easily that line could blur if left unchecked. He exhaled slowly, then reached forward, turning the key, the engine coming to life with a low hum, the sound grounding, familiar, and as he pulled out of the lot, the lights still flashing behind him, he did not look away from them, not immediately. He let them stay in his view for a second longer, as if acknowledging what they had represented before and what they would need to represent going forward, and then he drove on, merging into the flow of the city, just another patrol car on another call, but carrying with him something quiet, something steady, something that would not show in reports or records, but would shape the way he saw the next person and the one after that, long after the night had ended and the lights had stopped flashing.